The summer of 1984 had been unusually humid in the small industrial town just outside Dayton, Ohio. The kind of sticky heat that made the air feel heavy even before noon. That Saturday morning started like any other. Lawn sprinklers ticking across front yards, the distant hum of freight trains passing through town, and the faint smell of asphalt warming under the rising sun. 9-year-old Ethan Caldwell had been awake since sunrise, already dressed in his favorite red sneakers and a faded Cincinnati Reds cap that was slightly too big for his head. Ethan loved two things more than anything else: baseball and following his dad around like a shadow. His father, Mark Caldwell, worked construction, long hours, rough hands, steel-toed boots that left dusty prints across the kitchen floor. To Ethan, his dad wasn't just a construction worker. He was a builder of giants, factories, warehouses, places that looked like skeletons of something powerful waiting to come alive. So when Mark mentioned he had to stop by Worksite number 17 to grab some forgotten paperwork, Ethan begged to come along. Worksite number 17 sat on the edge of town, isolated behind chain-link fencing and orange warning signs that flapped lazily in the warm breeze. It was supposed to become a manufacturing plant, but at that stage, it was nothing more than exposed steel beams, half-poured concrete floors, and an unfinished elevator shaft that disappeared into darkness. On weekends, the site was quiet, no roaring machinery, no shouting foremen, no sparks flying from welding torches. Just wind moving through hollow corridors and the occasional creak of settling metal. Mark didn't plan to stay long. He parked his dusty pickup truck just outside the main structure, gravel crunching beneath the tires. He turned toward Ethan and gave him the same firm look he always used on site. "You stay in the truck, buddy. 5 minutes. Don't wander." Ethan nodded quickly, gripping his lunchbox even though it was empty. From the driver's seat, Mark watched his son for a second. Small hands pressed against the window, eyes scanning the towering beams with curiosity that felt bigger than his tiny frame. As Mark stepped out of the truck, the door slammed shut with a heavy echo that seemed to carry across the empty lot. The wind picked up slightly, rattling loose sheets of tin somewhere deep inside the structure. For a brief moment, Ethan sat quietly, watching his father disappear into the skeleton of Worksite number 17. The sun glinted off broken glass near the foundation, and a loose piece of caution tape fluttered wildly against a support column. Inside the truck, the air grew warmer, thicker, and Ethan's curious gaze slowly shifted toward the dark, open entrance of the building just a few yards away. When Mark Caldwell returned to the truck less than 5 minutes later, something felt wrong before he even reached the door. The driver's side was exactly as he left it, but the passenger door was slightly ajar. Not wide open, just enough to notice. The humid Ohio air had gone still, like the world itself had paused. Ethan's red sneakers were no longer visible against the seat. His baseball cap was gone. The lunchbox was gone. Mark called his son's name once, calmly at first, then louder, then in a voice that cracked across the empty worksite like breaking glass. Within 20 minutes, police cruisers were tearing down the gravel road toward Worksite number 17, sirens cutting through the morning air. Officers spread out across the half-built structure, their boots echoing against unfinished concrete floors. They checked under scaffolding, behind stacks of drywall, inside storage containers that hadn't been opened in weeks. The unfinished elevator shaft was searched with flashlights lowered carefully into the darkness below. Every hollow space, every shadowed corner was examined. But there were no signs of struggle. No skid marks in the dirt. No small footprints leading away from the truck. By afternoon, the search had escalated. K-9 units were brought in from neighboring counties. Bloodhounds circled the pickup, sniffing the door handles, the seats, the gravel beneath the tires. The dogs picked up Ethan's scent briefly, then lost it near the main entrance of the building. It was as if the trail simply dissolved into thin air. Officers widened the perimeter, checking nearby fields, drainage ditches, and a narrow creek that ran a quarter-mile behind the site. Volunteers from town began arriving, forming search lines that stretched across tall grass under the blazing sun. As hours turned into evening, floodlights illuminated Worksite number 17 like a crime scene in a movie. Reporters began gathering beyond the chain-link fence, microphones in hand, whispering phrases like possible abduction and suspicious circumstances. Parents in town locked their doors that night for the first time in years. Kids were called inside before sunset. The name Ethan Caldwell was suddenly on every radio station, every local TV broadcast. His school photo, wide smile, slightly crooked front tooth, flashed across screens again and again. Investigators questioned every worker connected to the site. Foremen, subcontractors, delivery drivers, even a security guard who claimed he hadn't been scheduled that weekend. Alibis were checked. Time cards reviewed. Equipment logs analyzed. But nothing stood out. No strange vehicles reported. No witnesses who saw a man near the truck. No ransom calls came in. And as midnight approached, with searchlights still scanning the hollow structure of Worksite number 17, a quiet fear began settling into the town. The kind of fear that creeps in when there are no answers, no clues, and no sound except the wind moving through an unfinished building. In the months following Ethan Caldwell's disappearance, Worksite number 17 stopped feeling like a construction project and started feeling like a wound the town couldn't close. Crews returned briefly under heavy supervision, but productivity collapsed. Workers moved differently inside the structure now, quieter, cautious, as if the unfinished walls were listening. The once ordinary sounds of hammering steel and pouring concrete echoed in a way that made people uneasy. Every hollow clang seemed too loud. Every dark corner felt occupied. Rumors spread fast in a small Ohio town. Some workers claimed tools had gone missing overnight. Others swore they heard faint footsteps on the upper level long after everyone had clocked out. One electrician reportedly refused to enter the elevator shaft area again after saying he felt a sudden cold draft brush past him, even though it was the middle of August. Officially, none of these claims were documented. Unofficially, they circulated through diners, barbershops, and backyard barbecues like whispered warnings. Then came the accidents. A scaffolding collapse that injured 2 men. A forklift malfunction that nearly crushed a supervisor. Inspectors cited safety violations, but some locals believed the site carried something heavier than faulty wiring or loose bolts. Insurance premiums spiked. Investors grew nervous. Within 3 years of Ethan vanishing, funding for the project quietly dried up. Construction halted mid-progress, leaving behind exposed beams, unfinished stairwells, and that gaping elevator shaft that plunged into darkness like an open throat. By 1987, the city officially suspended the project. Chain-link fencing was reinforced. No trespassing signs were bolted into place. Plywood boards covered lower windows, though many were later shattered by vandals. The building sat there on the edge of town, massive and incomplete, a concrete skeleton slowly rusting under Midwest winters and blistering summers. Kids dared each other to sneak inside. Teenagers tagged graffiti along the outer walls. But no one stayed long once the sun began to set. Over time, nature started reclaiming what industry had abandoned. Weeds cracked through pavement. Rainwater pooled along the foundation. Wind pushed through broken openings, producing low, hollow whistles that carried across the empty lot at night. From a distance, Worksite number 17 looked less like a factory and more like a monument, not to progress, but to something unfinished, something interrupted. And long after the official investigation cooled and the headlines faded, the structure remained standing, silent and looming at the edge of town. By the spring of 2026, Worksite number 17 had become little more than a decaying landmark on the edge of town, an eyesore to some, a ghost to others. City council meetings had debated its fate for years. Developers wanted the land cleared for a new logistics hub. Environmental inspectors called it a hazard. Locals simply called it cursed. After 4 decades of standing hollow against the Ohio skyline, the final vote passed quietly on a Tuesday night. The structure would be demolished by summer. News of the demolition stirred something long buried in the community. Older residents remembered the search parties. The sirens. The missing child posters taped to storefront windows. For Ethan Caldwell's surviving family, the announcement reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Reporters revisited the story, pulling archive footage from 1984, grainy clips of flashing police lights reflecting off unfinished steel beams. True crime bloggers labeled it the Worksite number 17 mystery, bringing a new generation's attention to a case many thought was forgotten. On Demolition Day, heavy machinery rolled in before sunrise. Excavators with steel jaws. Dump trucks idling in a line along the gravel road. The air smelled of diesel fuel and wet concrete after an overnight drizzle. Workers conducted safety briefings near the fenced perimeter, their voices echoing against the hollow facade. Most of them had heard the rumors. Some laughed them off. Others avoided looking too long at the upper floors where wind still moved through broken openings like a slow breath. Cameras from 2 local news stations were set up beyond the barricades, broadcasting live as the first chunks of exterior wall came down in clouds of dust. Each impact sent vibrations through the skeletal frame, shaking loose decades of rust and debris. Inside, demolition crews moved carefully through interior sections, tearing down non-load-bearing walls before targeting the main supports. It was during the removal of an interior concrete partition near the old elevator shaft that one worker paused mid-swing. His jackhammer struck the wall with a dull, hollow thud, different from the solid resistance they'd encountered all morning. He pulled back and hit it again. The sound echoed strangely, almost like there was empty space behind it. Another worker stepped closer, brushing away gray dust with a gloved hand. The concrete in that section looked slightly newer than the surrounding structure, smoother somehow, as if it had been poured separately. The crew exchanged uncertain glances before continuing to chip away at the surface, small fractures spreading across the wall in uneven lines. As the workers chipped away at the oddly smooth concrete, the hollow sound grew louder, almost unnatural. Dust filled the air, clinging to the sweat on their brows, and the echo of their tools seemed to bounce endlessly through the empty corridors of Worksite number 17. Then, with a sudden crack, a section of the wall gave way, revealing a narrow cavity just wide enough for a person to crawl through. The metal rebar had been carefully bent aside, almost as if someone had intentionally designed the space to be hidden. The crew shined flashlights inside. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't moved in decades, thick with dust and the faint trace of something metallic. In the dim light, they could make out a small red sneaker pressed into the corner, its laces tangled and yellowed. Beside it, a baseball cap, faded, frayed along the edges, and unmistakably belonging to a child, rested as if it had been dropped and forgotten. Then came the lunchbox, the kind every kid carried to school, with the name Ethan Caldwell still legible on the inside. The realization hit them before they could even speak. Forensic investigators were called immediately, and the scene was cordoned off. They approached cautiously, noting that the cavity's walls were smooth and the corners sharp, not accidental, but deliberately constructed. Every crevice was examined under magnifying lights, every inch of dust carefully collected for analysis. There were no footprints leading to or from the space, no signs that anyone had entered or exited in recent memory. The cavity was completely sealed from the outside, built within the framework of the structure in a way that had hidden it from view for more than 4 decades. Inside, small fragments of clothing clung to jagged edges of concrete. The sneaker had been scuffed, the cap worn thin from age. It was clear whoever had placed the items here had done so with meticulous care, almost ritualistic attention to detail. No other personal effects were present, no notes, no toys, nothing except the small, haunting reminders of a life abruptly interrupted. The hollow seemed almost impossible, yet undeniable. The walls pressed in on every side, cold and unyielding, as if the building itself had been complicit in holding this secret for so long. Outside the wall, workers and investigators stood in stunned silence. Even with decades of rumors and legends surrounding Worksite number 17, nothing could have prepared them for the stark reality of the hidden space. A small breeze filtered through broken windows, carrying dust and the faint echo of a child's laughter long gone. And yet, there was no sound now, only the faint hum of machinery outside and the oppressive weight of decades-old silence pressing down on everyone who dared to look inside. When forensic teams finally gained full access to the hidden cavity, the reality of what they had discovered sank in immediately. The narrow space was just big enough to hold a small child, with walls still cold and unyielding after more than 40 years. Carefully, investigators documented every item: Ethan's red sneaker, the faded baseball cap, and the small lunchbox with his name scrawled inside. But as they worked, a deeper horror began to surface. This was no accident. The space had been deliberately constructed, carefully concealed within the structure, sealed tight to remain untouched and unseen for decades. Forensic analysis revealed that Ethan had been trapped there shortly after his disappearance in 1984. The skeletal remains, fragile yet intact, confirmed the tragic timeline. But the most chilling discovery came from the cavity itself. The walls had been reinforced in a manner not listed on the original blueprints of Worksite number 17. Someone had modified the structure intentionally, creating a small, hidden room that could never be stumbled upon by accident. Every corner, every seam, was precise, as if the builder had wanted the secret to remain buried forever. Detectives combed through the interior for any indication that Ethan might have wandered in on his own. But nothing suggested that. No stray footprints, no scuff marks, no signs of struggle inside the narrow walls. The small sneaker and cap had not been tossed carelessly. They had been placed. The lunchbox rested deliberately at the far end of the cavity, almost like a marker or a signature. Whoever had done this had access to the building's structure, knew it intimately, and had planned the hiding place with an unsettling level of detail. As the investigation deepened, the realization grew heavier. Ethan's disappearance had been intentional. This was no wandering child lost in a construction site. This was premeditated, methodical, and horrifying. The worksite that had once seemed merely abandoned was now understood as a tomb, a deliberately hidden space that had shielded the truth from the world for over 4 decades. Every detail reinforced the grim conclusion. This was not a case of chance, misfortune, or oversight. Even the seasoned investigators were unsettled by the eerie precision. The cavity's walls, the placement of Ethan's belongings, and the way the space was sealed all pointed to someone who had carefully controlled every element of the boy's final moments. It was a realization that weighed down the entire team, leaving an unspoken question lingering in the stale air of the hidden room. Who had the knowledge, the access, and the intention to do something so meticulously sinister? And how had they escaped justice for so long? As police reopened the case, old records from 1984 were pulled from dusty filing cabinets and scanned for any overlooked clues. Investigators meticulously combed through employee rosters, contractor logs, and security reports, searching for anyone with access to the site during that fateful summer. One name immediately stood out: a subcontractor who had been working sporadically at Worksite number 17, and who abruptly resigned the week after Ethan vanished. At the time, his departure had been noted as personal reasons, but in retrospect, it seemed suspiciously convenient. The man in question had possessed specialized skills that allowed him to modify structural elements. Architects and engineers confirmed that the hidden cavity's construction could not have been part of the original plans. It required both knowledge and precision. Records showed he had unrestricted access to Worksite number 17, often moving between areas without supervision. Colleagues remembered him as quiet, methodical, and intensely private, the type who would go unnoticed while manipulating details others barely registered. Yet at the time, nothing linked him directly to Ethan's disappearance. When investigators dug deeper, they discovered another layer to the story. The subcontractor had died in 1999, years before modern forensic technology could analyze the crime scene. Despite his death, the evidence pointed overwhelmingly to him: access, opportunity, and the technical ability to create the hidden space. But what truly unsettled detectives was what they found years later in a storage unit owned by the man. Inside, neatly stacked, were yellowed newspaper clippings detailing Ethan Caldwell's disappearance. Every single clipping was carefully folded, almost ritualistically preserved, as if the man had been obsessed with the case long after it had gone cold. Family members who discovered the storage unit were horrified and quickly handed the materials over to law enforcement. The clippings themselves offered no explanation, just reminders of a tragedy frozen in time, a decades-old crime kept alive in someone's private archive. Police theorized that the man had meticulously planned the concealment of Ethan in a way that ensured no one could ever find him, and yet he had maintained a silent, twisted fascination with the aftermath, following the news and preserving every scrap of public record as a dark trophy. Even after the hidden space was fully exposed and the demolition of Worksite number 17 was underway, locals couldn't shake the sense of unease. Some claimed to hear faint sounds near the old elevator shaft, a whisper of movement, or perhaps the echo of a child long gone. Others swore the wind carried something more than dust through the broken windows. The town, which had long tried to forget the tragic story, was reminded in an almost tactile way that some secrets refused to stay buried, and that the chilling truth about Ethan Caldwell's disappearance would haunt Worksite number 17 forever. As the dust settled and the final walls of Worksite number 17 were torn down, Ethan Caldwell's story finally came to light, but the questions lingered. How could a community unknowingly harbor such a secret for over 4 decades? Who else knew? And what else might remain hidden in the shadows of abandoned buildings across America? Ethan's family finally received closure, yet the town never felt quite the same. The hollow structure was gone, but the memory of that summer morning in 1984, the fear, the whispers, and the silence of the hidden space remained embedded in every corner of the neighborhood. Some say the wind still moves through the empty lot, carrying a faint echo of a child's laughter, or perhaps a warning. A reminder that even in places we think are ordinary, darkness can quietly linger, waiting decades to reveal its secrets. And for anyone who hears this story, one thing is clear: sometimes, the most terrifying mysteries aren't those that vanish completely, but the ones that hide in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to be discovered.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.